Hello, my dear students. Welcome to my today's class. My dear students of Master's Final Year, Department of English. Here, this is Shongita Sarkar, Lecturer, Department of English, Government BM College, Borishal. So, let's start my today's class. My today's topic is Selected Poems by W.B. Yeats. You know, this is my second lecture on these topics. And in my previous class, I have mentioned the list before you. Here, there are 20 poems I have listed down. And I think in your honors level, you have read this poem, Sailing to Byzantium, No Second Choice, September 1913, A Prayer for My Daughter, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, that means number 2, 5, 6, 8 and 20. So we have to exclude this poem, but you may make the references from these poems. So today I will discuss on the list of the poems that I have listed down here. And you know, you have to take your preparation on these questions. That is W.B. Yeats as an Irish poet, symbols in his poetry. W.B. Yeats as a romantic poet, or analyze his poetry as a romantic poetry, style of his poetry, myths used in his poetry, and critical appreciation of Yeats' poems. Today I will focus on the top question, that is critical appreciation of Yeats' poems. At first, the title of the poem is When You Are Old. This poem, published in Yeats' second collection, The Rose, 1893, the speaker asks someone to think ahead to old age, strongly suggesting that the addressee will eventually regret being unwilling to return the speaker's love. Most critics agree that the poem is about Yeats' relationship with Morgan, an Irish actress and nationalist. So you know that Morgan was his beloved, and he wanted that lady much, but never get that lady. And on the basis of the idea or the face or the beauty of Morgan, based on that topics, he wrote the poem When You Are Old. Though the poem is one of the best loved of Yeats' works, it is based on a much earlier sonnet by Pierre de Ronsard, a 16th century French Renaissance poet. When you are old and your hair has turned grey and you are tired, starting to sleep as you sit by the fire, take a look at this book and read slowly, dreaming of the soft look that your eyes used to have, their deep shadows. This is the explanation that he explained in his book, or in that poem When You Are Old. How many people were affected positively by your happy and graceful moments, and either falsely or truly loved your beauty. One man loved the spiritual, searching soul in you and the sadness of your face. Then another poem, Among School Children. The poem Among School Children was composed after the poet's visit to a convent school in Waterford, Ireland in 1926. This poem moves from a direct consideration of the children to Yeats' early love, Morgan again, and then to a passionate philosophical conclusion in which all of Yeats' Platonic thinking blends into an exalted hymn of rage to the glory and the puzzle of human existence. Among school children by W.B. Yeats is considered as one of the most difficult poems. The subject of the poem revolved around the interpretation of matter and spirit. The poem reflects on the theme of meditation of life, love, and the creative process, and stands out for the poignancy and profundity that it holds. Then, at Yeats entered the school, he was received by an old nun who conducted him through different classes. The children in the classes looked with wonder at the 60 years old smiling public man. That means at that time the poet visited a school, he was 60 years old. At the sight of children, he is reminded of Morgan, his beloved, as she must have been a student like the girls who stood before him at that time. He recalls a particular day when she had told him now trivial incidents and reproof from the teacher would make her unhappy, and turned the entire day into the cheerless void. The poet had listened to her account and expressed sympathy till he completely identified with her. It was as if their two selves seemed to blend into one, like the yolk and white of an egg. At this point, there is an allusion of the myth that claims that man and woman were originally one, but since they forcefully separated, they always attempt to come together. Then the poet's thought keeps visualizing the image of Morgan, and he looks upon this girl and imagines that Morgan, too as a child, very much like the girl now standing before him. No doubt, her beauty was classical, like that of Helen, the daughter of the leader. The color of the cheeks and the hair of one particular girl reminded him of the complexion of his beloved. His imagination runs wild, and he sees her as if she were actually standing before him. So, when he visited that school, actually he visualizes the images of Morgan among the girl children. The poet then recalls the feature of Morgan in her old age. Her cheeks were hollow. She was old and decrepit and looked as if she subsisted on the wind and shadows in place of water and solid food. Even so, she was still a good model of a work of art. Naturally, poet is reminded of his own old age. He was quite good looking once. Old age and death are awful realities. One should accept the inevitable and make the best of a bad situation. This is the theme of the poem among school children. Then the next poem is Leda and the Swan. Leda and the Swan is a sonnet, a traditional 14-line poem in iambic pentameter. The structure of this sonnet is Petrarchan. The speaker retells a story from Greek mythology, the rape of the girl Leda by the god Zeus, who had assumed the form of a swan. Leda felt a sudden blow with the great wings of the swan still beating above her. Her things were pierced by the dark waves, and the nape of her neck was caught in his bill. he held her helpless breast upon his breast. The speaker wonders whether Leda, caught up by the swan and mastered by the brute blood of the air, assumed his knowledge as well as his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop. This is the quoted line that he mentioned in the poem. Like the second coming, Leda and the Swan describes a moment that represented a change of era in Yeats' historical model of gyres, which he offers in a vision, his mystical theory of the universe, but where the second coming represents the end of modern history. Leda and the Swan represents something like its beginning. As Yeats understands it, the history of Leda is that raped by the god Zeus in the form of a swan, she laid eggs, which hasted into Clytemnestra and Helen, and the war gods Castor and Polydeuces, and thereby brought about the Trojan War. Actually, I know from your fourth year syllabus, you know the history of Trojan War very much, and so I shouldn't discuss on that Trojan War again. Also, like the second coming, Leda and the Swan is valuable more for its powerful and evocative language. As an aesthetic experience, the sonnet is remarkable. Yeats combines words indicating powerful action. Powerful actions here: sudden blow, beating, staggering, beating, then shoulder, mustard, burning, mustard. Actually, these are the words showed the power that is expressed by Yeats with adjective and descriptive words that indicate Leda's weakness and helplessness, and that is showed by these words: cursed, helpless, terrified, vogue, loosening, thus increasing the sensory impact of the poem. Then the next poem is An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. An Irish Airman Foresees His Death was written by the Irish poet W.B. Yeats in 1918, told from the perspective of an Irish fighter pilot in World War I. The poem is critical of both the war in general and specifically of British rule over Ireland. The speaker argues that the outcome of the war is ultimately meaningless for his small community in Western Ireland, and that he feels no hatred towards his enemies nor love for the British. He pursues the dangerous pleasure of airborne combat not out of duty or patriotism, and is instead driven only by a lonely impulse of delight. The poem also serves as a memorial to Robert Gregory, an Irish airman and the son of one of his close friends who was killed in World War I at the age of 36. The speaker, an Irish airman fighting in World War I, declares that he knows he will die fighting among the clouds. He says that he does not hate those he fights, nor love those he guards. His country is Kilterton's cross, his countrymen Kilterton's poor. He says that no outcome in the war will make their lives worse or better than before the war began. He says that he did not decide to fight because of a law or a sense of duty, nor because of public men or cheering crowds. Rather, a lonely impulse of delight drove him to this tumult in the clouds. He says that he weighted his life in his mind and found that the years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind. Then the poem is The Stolen Child. The Stolen Child is a poem by W.B. Yeats published in 1889. The Wanderings of Oisin and Other Poems. More notable of Yeats' poems. The poem was written in 1886 and this is considered to be one of Yeats' more notable early poems. The poem is based on Irish legend and concerns fairies beguiling a child to come away with them. Yeats had a great interest in Irish mythology about fairies. The poem reflects the early influence of Romantic literature and pre-Raphaelite verse. It is thus that Yeats uses ambiguous language to explore the notion of the evil versus the angelic via the motif of the Irish mythological creatures. The fairies, defined as goddesses who control people's lives. The Stolen Child is a classic tale of living childhood and the search for identity. With just the right mix of fantasy and realism, Keith Denauhius had created a bedtime story for adults and a literary fable of remarkable depth and strange delights. Then the poem is The Tower. The speaker criticizes the absurdity of the contrast between his old body and his young spirit. He feels more passionate and inspired than ever, even more so than when he was a boy and went fishing in the mountains of Western Ireland. He feels he must say goodbye to poetry and choose reason instead. It is more becoming to his age. He walks to and fro atop a castle and looks out over the countryside. He sees where the wealthy Mrs. French once lived, her servant who knew her wishes well. Once cut off the ears of a rude farmer and brought them to her on a covered dish. When the speaker was young, some men spoke of a legendary peasant girl who was the most beautiful in the area. One drunk man talked of her often, and in the middle of a drinking session got up to seek her out. He mistook the moon for her lovely face and drowned in a lake. The man who told the speaker these songs was blind, like Homer. The girl may well be mistaken for the sun or moon, because, says the speaker, she has betrayed all living men. The speaker himself created 120 years ago. The speaker interrupts his own story, crying enough. He must remember a man so distraught that neither love nor music nor clipped ears could make him feel better. This man is a ruined master of the house. So here we see different stories of a person and that he experienced in his life. Before the house went to ruin, servants dressed for war came to the house. The speaker questioned them all, wondering whether they raged against age as he now does. They give no satisfactory answer. The speaker is happy to be left with Hanrahan. He calls up Hanrahan from the knowledgeable dead to tell him whether one thinks more often of a woman own or lost. The speaker draws up his will, leaving men who fish tirelessly his pride. His pride is not political or tied up with slaves or tyrants, but that of Grattan and Burke. His pride is as refreshing as an unexpected shower, as poignant as a swan song. He mocks Plato and Plotinus. He is prepared to die with a combination of ancient poetry and of the love of woman, both of which make man a superhuman. He leaves his faith and pride to these young fishermen. He will now prepare his body and his mind for death, or worse, the death of those whom he has loved. The dialogue of self and soul. W.B. Yeats was born into a middle-class Church of Ireland family. That is, he was a product of Protestant and English descent. His grandfather and great-grandfather were members of the clergy. His father, however, rebelled against the family's religious life. So, Yeats was not reared in the traditional Christian faith, although Christian imagery and beliefs, especially moral, remained a continuing and powerful elements in his poetry. For instance, his Crazy Jane poems thematically echo the conflicts between Christian morality and human desire, which are the concerns of a dialogue of self and soul. A dialogue of self and soul in the seventh section of Vacillation, although in the later poem the debate is between the soul and the heart. Certainly, a knowledge of the story of the conception and birth of Christ, as well as of that birth's religious significance, is necessary for the reader of the antithetical images of Yeats' The Second Coming. However, Yeats' own religious life was a committed interest in, faith in, and even practice of various occult beliefs from his early involvement with Eastern religions. He was far from being a rationalistic unbeliever. Yeats was also an Irish patriot and regarded Irish culture as his own. His earliest works are steeped in Irish myth. At the same time, however, he was intensely proud of his English ancestry and felt himself a part of historical European high culture. He would never really leave Irish myth behind, but his commitment to the European tradition, based as it was on the Christian religion, was almost everywhere in his writings. He made direct use of his own life, especially in his later works, a use that gives solidity, facts, and images to his poetry, making them more live. The Gyres. The Gyres is about an old man on the verge of death. As he reflects in his existence and the destruction of civilization around him. However, the poem is a bit more complicated than that. Yeats frequently wrestled with the theme of generational differences between and the old and the young. In his poems Sailing to Byzantium and The Gyres, the narrator seems to come to the same conclusion. Just as his generation ignored any wisdom of their elders, so does he now find himself ignored. The narrator for The Gyres takes a strange kind of comfort in the circling and repeating mechanisms of life. He knows that soon the younger generation will find themselves in his position. Lapis Lazuli. Lapis Lazuli belongs to W.B. Yeats' late phase in the 1930s. Like a number of Yeats' other late poems, it is concerned with the place and treatment of art in the modern world, a situation which Yeats considers by taking in all of history. The poem's argument takes a bit of unpacking. Before we get to our analysis, here is a reminder of these mysterious poems. Lapis lazuli is a deep blue mineral. Here it refers to the medallion of this chinaware presented to the poet. The poet has listened to the cries of hysterical women who are panicky and secret of the preparations for the Second World War. They are sick of the painter's palette and the musical instrument of the singer and the poet's compositions because all of them are happy and gay. So I think that's all about my today's lecture, and you should take your preparation, or you have to read all of these poems, the critical appreciation of these poems, and you have to read the questions, practice those questions. So that's all about my today's lecture. Stay at home and stay safe.